I was going to say good afternoon, but good evening, everybody. My name's Michael Deas. I work as the coordinator in Europe for a Palestinian organization called the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions National Committee, which is a coalition of trade unions, of NGOs, of popular committees and political parties that works to lead and support the movement for boycott, divestment and sanctions as a way of holding Israel to account and as a way of pressuring Israel to comply with international law. I wanted to start quickly by saying it would have been one of the strengths of the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement is that it's a Palestinian-led movement. So it would have been much better if one of my Palestinian colleagues was able to represent us here today, but unfortunately no one was available. So what I'm going to quickly do is introduce the concept of boycott, divestment and sanctions and the concept of taking action internationally to end the international support that Israel depends on. To talk a little bit about military relations with Israel, talk a little bit about free trade agreements with Israel and how they embolden Israeli impunity, to talk about the role that private companies played in the recent attack on Gaza and play in maintaining Israeli apartheid, and also talk about the really exciting growing cultural boycott of Israel. So this summer's massacre of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip served as a really painful reminder, I think, that Israel continues to be allowed to act with almost complete impunity. Time and time again today, we've heard people express their concern that Israel will be allowed to get away with what it did over the summer. And far from holding Israel accountable, most governments actually provide Israel with the political support, the economic support, the military support that it needs to be able to carry out its massacres. Western governments also fail to prevent corporations headquartered in their countries from participating directly in Israel's crimes. When those in power stay silent in the face of crimes against humanity, when those in power facilitate and support crimes against humanity, it's the role of civil society, it's our role to take action to end international complicity and to develop our own effective forms of accountability. And this really is the logic of the call that was made in 2005 by an overwhelming majority of Palestinian civil society organizations, including all of the major political parties, all the major NGOs and popular committees and trade unions, for boycotts, divestment, and sanctions against Israel. And the BDS appeal urges various forms of pressure on Israel until it complies with international law by doing three things: by ending its occupation, by ensuring Palestinian citizens of Israel are able to enjoy full equality, and by allowing Palestinian refugees, who, let's not forget, make up the majority of the Palestinian population, to return to their homes. And I think this summer's massacre implores us to look at the successes that the BDS movement has already achieved and to work out what we can do to build a movement that can really isolate Israel in the way that South Africa was isolated under apartheid. I wanted to turn now just to the military embargo, and I think one of the things that stands out, listening to the presentations earlier, is the sheer force, the sheer military might that Israel unleashed on the Gaza Strip over the summer. Israel's ability to unleash this military might and to maintain its daily human rights violations stems largely from the vast international military cooperation it maintains with governments and companies across the world. And this international military cooperation with Israel really takes three forms. Firstly, you have exports of weapons to Israel, the huge amounts of imports of weapons from Israel, particularly to the West, and also joint projects and research. And all three of these forms of military cooperation with Israel are really essential to allowing Israel's military-industrial complex to function. With regards to sales of arms to Israel and the financing of the Israeli military machine, the US, of course, bears a really heavy responsibility. As we've already heard today, over the period 2009 to 2018, US military aid to Israel is expected to reach $30 billion, much of which will be used to purchase weapons and other military equipment from US military companies. But I think there's a danger, especially for those of us based in Europe, that we allow this huge US military aid to Israel to forget the role that's played by the EU and the EU member states as well. So in the period 2005 to 2009, European Union member states granted exports granted arms licenses to military exports to Israel worth 7.4 billion euros. And weapons exports during 2012 were worth 613 million euros, which was up 290% on the previous year. So without doubt, Israel's recent war crimes in Gaza were carried out using weapons manufactured in the US, using weapons manufactured here in Europe. It's also important, I think, to look at the really important role played by exports of arms from Israel to the West, because Israel's military machine really wouldn't be able to function without them. Israel's constant use of violence, not just its regular massacres, but its daily occupation, provides the Israeli military industry with the opportunity to test and develop new technology. And what you see is Israel's large military companies openly, flagrantly advertising its products as field tested. The phrase field tested comes directly from a brochure published by Elbit Systems, which is Israel's largest weapons company. When Elbit Systems says that its weapons are field tested, what they mean is that they've been tested on the bodies of Palestinians. And according to its own statistics, Israel is the fourth largest arms exporter in the world. And what this means is that roughly 1 in 10 Israeli households are now economically dependent on Israel's military industry. So imports of arms and military equipment from Israel create, firstly, they provide a huge income for Israel's militarized economy, but they also create a really powerful economic incentive for ongoing militarism. Also, Israel is the world's largest exporter of drones, and it's a major exporter of advanced security technology. This means that Israel is also exporting its ideology of oppression and exporting the technologies that it's developed to oppress Palestinians. To give a quick example of that, the apartheid wall that runs through the West Bank has really sophisticated surveillance equipment that was supplied again by that company I mentioned, Elbit Systems. Elbit Systems was recently awarded a huge $180 million contract to build a wall on the US-Mexico border. So we see really clearly that Israel is exporting its ideology of oppression. So this extensive military cooperation between Israel and the rest of the world, it really facilitates Israel's ability to carry out its massacres. And given this, the demand for a military embargo on Israel has been a key demand of Palestinian civil society. And it was also a key slogan of the huge mobilizations in solidarity with Gaza that we saw take place this summer. And as a result of these big mobilizations, we saw the Spanish government introduce a temporary ban on arms exports to Israel, and we saw a major public debate on implementing an arms embargo in European countries, especially the UK, Italy, and Ireland, although unfortunately none of those three countries actually went the full way and introduced a military embargo. Campaigning for a military embargo, though, it also means pressuring the private companies and the public institutions that have links with Israel's military machine to cut those links, to divest from Israeli military companies. So far, we've persuaded at least 8 major banks and pension funds to sell their shares in Elbit Systems, and over the summer, we saw a wave of occupations at factories owned by Elbit Systems in the UK, in Australia, and just a few days ago in Glasgow. A military embargo on Israel is really long overdue, and it would form a really key, a really crucial step towards ending Israel's unlawful use of military force. And I think it should become a key focus for all of us outside working to support the Palestinian struggle. I want to look now at free trade agreements and other forms of bilateral relations with Israel just quickly, because besides military relations, it's these free trade agreements that Israel has with other states that is really one of the biggest forms of support that it enjoys. And to take as an example, as we're in Brussels, the EU-Israel Association Agreement, which was signed in 2000 and was upgraded in 2012. The association agreement facilitates pretty much unrestricted trade between the EU and Israel and allows Israel to participate in more European Union programs than any other non-European country. And we begin to see here a bit of a double standard, Because back in 2010, when the Sri Lankan government was accused of war crimes, the EU almost immediately suspended its association agreement with Sri Lanka. In the last couple of months, we've seen the EU take really strong action against Russia, including trade sanctions. And we've seen the EU take this kind of action against dozens of other countries in the last couple of years. Recently, a group of 24 Palestinian civil society organizations wrote to the European Union demanding the suspension of the association agreement, and they warned that the double standard with which the EU was treating Israel sends a clear message to Israel that its massacres of Palestinians will be tolerated. As well as this sort of political support that derives from this double standard, Israel's participation in EU programs often provides it with really direct support that allows it to carry out its massacres. So, for example, Israel's able to participate in something called the FP7 research framework funding system. So Israeli military companies, Israeli universities are able to receive European Union research funding on the same basis as European companies or European universities. Since 2007, Israeli military companies have received over 200 million euros worth of this EU funding. Very often, Israeli military companies are receiving EU funding to develop drones and to develop other military equipment. So it seems highly probable that this summer's massacre in Gaza was carried out using technology that the European Union directly helped to develop. There is, however, increasing opposition to business as usual relations with Israel. During the recent attack on Gaza, the Chilean parliament voted to suspend negotiations on a free trade agreement with Israel. We saw 5 different Latin American ambassadors recall their 5 different Latin American countries recall their ambassadors to Israel. We saw Bolivian President Evo Morales endorse the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions movement, speak of his support for it, and we saw the government of Maldives suspend several economic agreements it has with Israel. We've also begun to see this kind of shift slowly, very slowly, but start to take place in Europe as well. Last June, the European Union responded to years of campaigning by civil society organizations by publishing new rules that prevent the EU from providing funding to Israeli entities that are based in illegal Israeli settlements. In the past couple of months, we've seen the Left Group and the Green Group of the European Parliament speak of their support for the suspension of the EU-Israel Association Agreement. And just a couple of days ago, the Danish foreign minister said that the EU was now beginning to discuss openly for the first time that there were internal discussions about trade sanctions on Israel. I think we do also need to remember, though, that asking the EU to suspend its free trade agreement is really quite a large demand, a rather sort of long-term demand. If we feel that it's too big a step for the EU to take now, we should at least ask the EU to fully implement the obligations that it was given by the International Court of Justice in 2004. And in 2004, the International Court of Justice ruled that states should make sure they're not providing any support or recognition to Israel's illegal settlements. And at the very least, this should mean that the European Union should ban all trade, all economic relations with illegal settlements. One thing that I think would be really useful to come out of the tribunal is if we could examine in a bit more detail the third state obligations, the legal obligations that third states have as a result of Israel's massacre on Gaza. What obligations do third states that have free trade agreements with Israel have? Are they obliged to suspend those agreements as a result of Israel's war crimes? I want to turn now to the role played by private corporations. As Israel has sought to entrench its apartheid system, entrench its occupation, and as it's embraced neoliberalism, private companies have played an increasingly important role in Israel's matrix of control. So private companies act as subcontractors. So, for example, the British company G4S helps Israel to run its prisons. The French multinational Viola helps Israel to build infrastructure for illegal Israeli settlements. The big US IT firm, Hewlett-Packard, runs the IT systems for the Israeli military. And also retailers, by importing products from Israel, especially importing products from illegal Israeli settlements, provide an economic incentive for the continued colonization of Palestinian land. Thankfully, what we've begun to see in the last couple of years is that determined grassroots campaigning has seen a massive rise in participation in consumer boycotts of Israel. So very often I take part in actions outside supermarkets in London where we're leafleting, asking people not to buy Israeli goods. And I've been amazed, especially in the last 6 months, how many people say, oh, no, it's okay, I don't buy Israeli goods anyway. In fact, just on the taxi here in the morning, the taxi driver, I'd mentioned that I was coming to a conference on Palestine, and even before I'd mentioned boycott, he was telling me that I shouldn't buy Israeli products. And we'd never really understood whether this was having an impact. But what we began to see during the war on Gaza was some really interesting media reports in the Israeli media. Israeli exporters were reporting an unprecedented wave of cancellations. One major exporter was quoted as saying that they'd shut down their whole operation for exporting products to the UK because none of the big supermarkets were willing to take Israeli products. And many European retailers now publicly claim not to stock products from illegal Israeli settlements whatsoever. We've also had a really successful campaign in the last year or two against the Israeli company Sodastream, which makes these home machines for carbonating water. I've never quite understood them, why people buy them. But we've been picketing shops that sell Sodastream. We've got retailers across Europe to stop stocking the products. And Sodastream's share price has fallen 50% in the last year. But the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement is about much more than just not buying Israeli products. It's about getting people to organize in their workplaces, to organize in their communities, in their unions, to get institutions, to get governments, to get companies to join the boycott as well. And perhaps the most successful example of this sort of campaigning is the campaign against the French multinational Viola, which is a huge transport waste water company. In Palestine, Viola is building infrastructure for illegal Israeli settlements. So we've been going all the way across Europe, we've been going to local municipalities who use Viola to collect the rubbish or run the transport system and say, no, we don't want our public money going to a company that's assisting Israel with its war crimes. The first big contract that Viola lost was back in 2009 when it lost a 3.5 billion euro contract to help run the Stockholm metro system. We've replicated that success with municipalities across the Netherlands, across France, across Belgium, across the UK, and we estimate that Viola has now lost at least 15 billion euros as a result of BDS campaigning. And unsurprisingly, Viola announced over the summer that it's starting to sell off its Israeli business altogether. We've also seen sort of really interesting developments, especially in the US, where communities are coming together, trade unions are coming together, or churches are coming together and saying, hang on, as a community, we hold a pension fund together. We don't want this pension fund to be invested in Israeli companies that are helping to violate international law. So in the US, we've seen the Presbyterian Church, the United Methodist Church, and the Mennonite churches, so 3 of the biggest churches in the US, vote at their general assemblies to divest from companies that participate in Israel's crimes. Another thing we've seen over the last couple of months is across the west coast of the US, where Israeli ships would arrive at ports to unload their cargo, only to discover huge community pickets were preventing them from unloading their products. The most successful of these actions was in Oakland, California, where an Israeli ship was prevented from docking for 4 consecutive days. So all of these grassroots efforts are in turn creating an environment where businesses are feeling the pressure, feeling the heat, feeling the need to distance themselves from Israel's crimes, even when they've not been directly targeted publicly by the BDS movement. So in January, the Dutch pension giant PGGM announced it was divesting from 5 Israeli banks due to the role that they play in supporting illegal settlements. In the months that followed, banks and pension funds from Norway, Luxembourg, Netherlands, the US, and Denmark all made similar announcements. And there was a survey earlier this year of Dutch institutional investors that found that 1 in 7 major Dutch banks and pension funds had divested from Israel or international companies that help Israel with its crimes, but hadn't announced their decision to do so publicly. To me, this suggests that what we know about the divestment that we know about is actually only the tip of the iceberg. And there's a lot of silent boycotting, silent divestment taking place as well. So in Europe, at least, it seems that grassroots action is starting to sort of fundamentally shift private sector attitudes towards doing business in Israel. And we're fast approaching a tipping point where participating in Israel's violations of international law simply don't make good business sense anymore. I've got 2 more sections. I'll be quick. Perhaps the most visible and the most exciting type of boycott, divestment, and sanctions action that's been taking place in recent years is with regards to the cultural boycott. When big international artists go and perform in Israel, they do Israel a big favor. They help Israel create this idea, reinforce this idea that it's trying to sell to the world, that it's a liberal European democracy like any other. So what we've been doing, particularly since 2008, 2009, is using social media, using letter writing, holding small demonstrations at concerts, persuading artists not to go and perform in Israel. And we've had some absolutely huge names refuse publicly to perform in Israel. And this is slightly strange, because usually the first name that I mention in this category is Roger Waters. But other artists that have cancelled include the Pixies, Elvis Costello, Vanessa Paradis. I was speaking recently with a friend who's a session musician and has played at some of the big festivals in the UK, and he said that the attitude among A-list artists had changed. And actually now most artists were simply unwilling to go and perform in Israel, just as big artists would have been unwilling to perform in Israel, unwilling to perform in South Africa during apartheid. Israel, there was a big rock festival that was meant to take place in Israel last summer that had to be completely abandoned because they couldn't find enough international artists to fill up the program. These cancellations have a huge impact. They're widely reported in the Israeli media. They force ordinary Israelis, especially young Israelis, to confront the fact that the world is growing increasingly tired of Israel's continued violations of international law. Whereas it's very easy to dismiss the solidarity movement as leftists or anti-Semites, it's much harder to dismiss these big A-list celebrities. So just to say a couple of things to finish. The BDS movement isn't very old. It's only been going 10 years or so, and it's only since 2008, 2009 that it's really picked up and begun to win mainstream support. But we have already shown that we can force governments, we can force big companies to end some aspects of their support for Israel's crimes. And these successes perform a really important function. They help us to educate a broader audience. They help us to chip away at this image that Israel tries to craft of itself as a normal liberal democracy. They help us to reveal Israel to be a state practicing colonialism and practicing apartheid. Okay.